I'm Jay Desio from Drone-Works. Professional photographers and videographers take great pains in getting the shot just right. They painstakingly set the framing for the effect they want, and they manually set the exposure to capture the perfect image. Most recreational flyers rely on automatic settings, and the cameras on our aircraft do a pretty good job at getting a good exposure. But is it the best combination of settings? Many times it's not. To get the most out of your images, it's important to understand the camera settings and how they affect your video and photos. In this video, we'll discuss the exposure triangle and neutral density filters, and how these tools can help you take your images to the next step. Let's go! The exposure triangle shows the three camera settings for setting a proper exposure. These settings go back to the days when film was used and is still used today in digital imaging. The three sides of the exposure triangle are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now that we know what the three sides of the exposure triangle are, let's take a look at what they do. In the days of film, ISO was the speed of the film, how fast the film reacts to light. In digital imaging, it's how sensitive the sensor is to light. A lower ISO is less sensitive to light and requires a longer exposure, while a higher ISO number is more sensitive to light and requires a shorter exposure. Something to keep in mind, a lower ISO results in more saturation, more detail, and less noise. A higher ISO results in less saturation, less detail, and more noise. Shutter speed is the length of time the shutter is open. The smaller the fraction, the longer the shutter is open. Aperture is the size of the opening of the lens. A larger aperture lets in more light, while a smaller aperture lets in less light. The smaller the number, the wider the aperture. The aperture also affects the depth of field, which is how the camera focuses on close and far subjects at the same time. Each setting on the exposure triangle is called a stop and represents either twice the amount of light or half the amount of light, depending on which way you move the stop. Many cameras have additional settings between the ones shown in the exposure triangle. These are not full stops, but incremental spots between full stops. Changing the ISO from 200 to 400 increases the amount of light by one stop, which is twice as much light. Changing the shutter speed from 1/20th of a second to 240th of a second decreases the amount of light by one stop, which is half the amount of light. Changing the aperture from f4 to f2.8 increases the amount of light by one stop, which is double the amount of light. Once a proper exposure is set, any change in stop in ISO, shutter speed, or aperture requires an equal number of stop changes in one or more of the other components to maintain the proper exposure. For example, a proper exposure for your scene is set at ISO 200, shutter speed 1/240th, and aperture of f4. If you want to change the aperture from f4 to f8, you are decreasing the amount of light by two stops. You will need to increase the light by two stops using one or both of ISO and shutter speed. You can move the ISO one stop from 200 to 400 and move the shutter speed one stop from 240th of a second to 120th of a second. You have now increased the amount of light a total of two stops to offset the two-stop change in aperture. Some aircraft have variable apertures, which permits full use of the exposure triangle. Examples of aircraft with variable aperture lenses are the Phantom 4 Pro, Phantom 4 Advanced, and the Mavic 2 Pro. These photos show what happens when you properly make changes in the camera settings. In each photo, ISO was maintained at 100, the aperture was closed one stop, and the shutter speed was slowed by one stop to offset the aperture change. Proper exposure was maintained for all the photos with these changes. These videos demonstrate changes in all three segments of the exposure triangle. From left to right, each video had the aperture opened by 1 stop and the shutter speed increased by 1 stop to compensate. ISO 100 was maintained for 5 videos and then was increased when the aperture could no longer be opened further. These videos are the first and last video from the previous segment. These videos were slowed down to 10% of normal speed. The differences in these videos are the left video had a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second with a fully closed aperture. The video on the right had a much faster shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second and the aperture opened as far as it can be. The ISO was also increased from 100 to 400, making the sensor faster. Notice the propellers in both videos. The left video is much more natural with the shutter speed being twice the frame rate. This demonstrates how different combinations of settings can be used to achieve the effect you want. What if you have an aircraft that does not have a variable aperture, such as a Phantom 3 series, original Phantom 4, Mavic Pro, Mavic 2 Zoom, Autel Evo, and many other aircraft? These aircraft have fixed aperture lenses which are wide open, usually in the f2.4 to f2.8 range. In order to gain the benefit of a variable aperture, you'll need to use a neutral density filter, also known as ND filters. Neutral density filters reduce the amount of light entering the lens without changing the color properties. While ND filters are a must-have accessory for fixed aperture lenses to take full advantage of the exposure triangle, they can also be used with variable aperture lenses. There are many instances where an ND filter is used to slow shutter speed beyond the capabilities of the camera's settings. Drone-WorksPRO recommends PolarPro ND filters. PolarPro ND filters are high quality, backed by great customer service. PolarPro publishes an easy-to-use reference chart. Installation of the ND filters may vary by aircraft. Consult your owner's manual for details.